Imagine a thought experiment known as quantum suicide. A person sits in front of a lethal device connected directly to a quantum trigger. The machine rapidly calculates an outcome and then locks into a final, definitive position. Under an ordinary view of reality, this is just a deadly game of chance. You pull the trigger, and a random subatomic event decides your fate. You face an even split between walking away unharmed and instant oblivion. But under the concept of quantum immortality, your fate changes completely. Because your consciousness requires a living brain to exist, from your own first-person perspective, you will always find yourself in the timeline where the device fails to fire. On the surface, this reads like a science fiction superpower, a loophole in the laws of nature that guarantees eternal life. However, if we pull the concept apart, it conceals a devastating logical flaw. To understand the trap, we have to look at the measurement problem in modern physics. At the subatomic level, particles exist in a blur of multiple possibilities at once. Scientists have spent a century trying to understand how those infinite possibilities resolve into a single concrete reality. In this animated diagram, you can see a model of physicist Hugh Everett's many worlds interpretation. Instead of collapsing into one outcome, a single quantum event splits into two diverging paths, which then exponentially split into 4, 8, and so on. Under this view, reality is a vast branching structure. Every single possible outcome actually occurs, but through a process called decoherence, they unfold in completely isolated timelines that no longer interact. Quantum immortality leans on this exact architecture. It assumes that as reality fractures into billions of paths, your local point of view is forced to ride the branching structure forward, only ever continuing down the specific timelines where you manage to survive. The first problem with this assumption is biological. The thought experiment relies on a device that offers an instantaneous binary outcome, life or death. But real death is a process of progressive failure, like severe oxygen loss, massive cellular damage, complete neural breakdown, and finally, a coma. The strict logic of the theory does not promise youth, health, or a coherent mind. It only requires the absolute minimum physical threshold of awareness to keep a point of view from completely disappearing. Looking at this diagram, a solid timeline representing a whole, healthy life begins to fracture. Without the requirement for an intact brain, eternal life thins out into broken, degraded segments of pain, severe amnesia, and neurological ruin. Philosophers describe this end state as probabilistic ghostliness. As your biological systems fail, your existence becomes mathematically suspended at the absolute margins of reality, unable to fully function but incapable of completely shutting down. Strip survival of physical wholeness, and the fantasy sours. This specific form of eternal life stops looking like a comforting gift and becomes an inescapable, everlasting prison cell. Even if we ignore the biological degradation, a second major problem remains. The entire premise rests on the idea that there is a stable, continuous self traveling down these surviving branches. In everyday life, we treat our identity as a solid object. We feel like the exact same person from one decade to the next because our bodies repair themselves slowly and our psychological shifts happen gradually enough to preserve the illusion of a single identity. The many worlds interpretation shatters that illusion. As we can see in this diagram, a single observer experiences a branching event and immediately proliferates into dozens of distinct descendant nodes, each accumulating different internal geometry to represent new experiences. Over time, these small divergences compound. One surviving branch sustains an injury, another experiences a different environment and forms entirely new memories. The sheer volume of radical changes destroys the idea that these descendants are numerically identical to the original observer. What remains is a concept known as successor bias. In a branching event, there will always be a future observer who retains your memories. Because memory presents itself from the inside as an inheritance, that new observer will naturally and incorrectly interpret their existence as a first-person continuation of you. The theory offers absolutely no guarantee that your personal center of awareness avoids death. It only guarantees the endless production of fragmented descendants who simply claim your past as their own. Mainstream physics largely rejects the entire premise. Neuroscience treats consciousness as a biological process generated by a physical brain, not an invisible thread that can magically leap from a dying body into a surviving one. Furthermore, it fails a basic requirement of the scientific method: it cannot be proven wrong. From the outside, the process is entirely invisible to other observers. From the inside, any narrow survival can be reinterpreted as evidence for the theory in a self-confirming loop. Quantum immortality operates less as a physics equation and more as a highly effective psychological mirror. It exposes our deep-seated desperation to imagine a form of continuation that escapes our physical biology. The human mind builds these concepts because it has only ever experienced continuity. Because awareness cannot easily model a future in which it is absolutely absent to witness anything, it reaches for elaborate substitutions. But when we contrast the absolute finality of a clean ending against a sprawling nightmare of indefinite, splintering persistence, the traditional concept of death takes on a different tone. Boundaries define the structure of significance. We recognize urgency and meaning precisely because time runs in a single direction, because choices permanently exclude their alternatives, and because the people we care about can actually be lost. Rather than a technical problem waiting to be solved by subatomic mathematics, absolute death serves as a structural boundary. It is the necessary horizon that makes a human life a complete, recognizable, and meaningful whole.